Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host, Rashid, and thank you for joining us on another edition of the most powerful platform for truth, bar none, on YouTube. And it is with my pleasure, and I think it's a privilege to introduce our next guest, and I'll let him introduce himself as I bring him on the platform. And I want to thank him in advance for joining me, Mr. Glenn Diesen. See if they'll allow me to bring him up. How's it going today, Glenn?
Oh, very good. Thank you.
Well, before we get into this, the talking, would you please inform the few people out there who may not be familiar with you, and it has to be a small amount of people that's not familiar with you.
Oh, well, thanks. That's very kind to hear. Well, I'm a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. I've been here a few years. Before that, I was a professor at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. So my main focus tends to be political science, political economy, and yes, lesser extent sociology. So yes, my main research area would be then how Russia, China, India, and other countries in the East are trying to rewire or restructure the international economic system towards what they often refer to as the Greater Eurasian Partnership, to have a more decentralized economic system.
Well, before we get into that economic part, can I ask you, because you're in Norway, what is the temperature on the ground, especially concerning the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, and why aren't the governments of Europe listening to the people that they govern?
Well, the Ukrainian conflict is a bit strange in this country because we've actually had always a reasonable good relationship with Russia. We have a small border all the way up in the north. And interestingly enough, during the Second World War, we were occupied by Nazi Germany. The Russians actually came and liberated the northern parts of our country, and then after burying their dead, they went home. So, but we still speak in the NATO language that once the Russians come to liberate, they never leave. But with us, they did leave. So, but still, we subscribe to that NATO narrative. So, I think that's why it's a bit surprising to me that we've become one of the more hostile countries in terms of sending a lot of weapons compared to our small population, and hosting more American troops, which would be fine if they weren't there to counter Russia, which is problematic for us. So I've been taken a bit by surprise by how aggressive the policies went, and also the media, managing the media landscape, or propaganda, if you will, has been also dialed up to the extreme, in which there's effectively no discourse at all at the moment. They gave us two options. You can either say that this was an unprovoked attack in which there's nothing to negotiate, and Russia just want to restore the Soviet Union, or if you try to explain what Russia's done, its main concerns, then you are accused then of legitimizing it, apologizing for it, and even supporting the invasion, in which you have to be censored and ideally canceled. So effectively, everyone has to subscribe to this one narrative, which is we have that it was an unprovoked attack. And if it's unprovoked, if it's pure opportunism, then obviously we should send as much weapons as possible to increase the cost and reduce the benefits of this invasion. However, if what we're not allowed to say, if Russia reacts to what it perceives as a security threat, then we're making matters much, much worse. And if we had proper free speech, and then we might have very different policies. But this is the problem of censorship. You don't allow the best ideas and truth to come forward. Instead, you have these very skewed narratives.
Well, I was thinking about something that you just said, that they say that once Russia comes in, they never leave. That is an adage of the United States. If one looks at the United States policies, once they enter a country, it is absolutely almost impossible for them to leave. They never willingly leave. Even right now, as they claim to have withdrawn from Afghanistan, there are still assets on the ground in Afghanistan. Why would Sweden in itself be subject itself to American colonization, because that's in reality what it is. Because once the United States, I remember as I'm speaking now, something just came to me. I remember that prior to Sweden becoming a NATO ally or NATO member or whatever, they were saying, the United States said that they had no plans on setting up military bases there, and the United States said they have no plans on permanent troop deployments, and all of that is going out the window, and the media is saying nothing about that. Why does the West seem to ignore those things and project? Because everything that they're saying about Russia is a projection from NATO and the United States. Why is that? And why isn't anyone like taking them to task on these things?
Well, I think it's because they've been able to control the narrative to great of an extent. And I think in this part of the world, Scandinavia, I think it has very detrimental impact. And in the past, we used to speak, used to have more common sense. So in this country, in Norway, we were always part of NATO from day one, but we were kind of like NATO light. We said we didn't want any foreign troops permanent on our soil. We were careful not to have too many warships from the British and Americans up in the high north, where we have bordered with Russia. And this wasn't to be kind with Russia. This was we recognized a security dilemma. That is, we wanted a good partnership with the Americans, so we have security. However, you don't want to provoke the adversary, because if you put a lot of military assets on the Russian border, Russia will respond in kind, and then your security is diminished. So, so that was in our own interest, and we tried to always have a good balance between being a good neighbor to the Russians and a good ally to the Americans. But since the end of the Cold War, we threw that out the window, and gradually there's this drip incrementalism. We started by having a few troops, American troops, coming, and then we said, oh, it doesn't break our policy about having foreign troops because they're not here permanent, they're rotating. But once one batch of Americans leave, another one comes. And now we're going to open 4 military bases, which the US has full jurisdiction. And again, we're not allowed to call them military bases. We call them sovereign territories or something along those lines, in which that is the Americans having sovereignty jurisdiction in those areas. So it's very strange. So it comes very gradual. So the population gets used to this new way. Now with Sweden and Finland, I think it's a different. Well, they're also Scandinavian, of course, but it's also perplexing me because Finland was the greatest case study of neutrality, if there ever was one. They had wars with the Russians, then they committed themselves after World War II. They were going to be neutral, this huge border, and no problems. And this worked well. And now they decided, now they joined NATO, and there was no debate. The main argument seemed to be, well, Putin doesn't want NATO on its borders. Now look how much NATO they have. So they went from being a successful neutral country to being the biggest front line against Russia. And no one answers the question if this will make any of us any safer. And I think not. But again, we're not even having the discussion. So all of Scandinavia, which tended to be a region of stability, is now, I think, will have a much darker future coming ahead.
Do they ever, does the leadership in Europe ever contemplate going one step too far and provoking Russia? Because it seems like they double down on failed policies following the United States, and it seems like there are no adults in the room, and they continue to push and push and push, and there's a limit to everybody's patience. Do they ever sit down and discuss that?
Yeah, well, sadly not too much in the open, but through some mediums such as WikiLeaks, we do get some inputs, in which we, for example, see in 2008 when they made the decision that yes, we're going to bring in Ukraine and Georgia. Everyone knew that this was a bad idea. At the time, you had the U.S. ambassador to Russia, who's now the director of the CIA, which is William Burns. He made this point that two things can happen. One, there will be a civil war likely because at that time only 20% of Ukrainians actually wanted to join NATO, so it would be a very divisive topic. It would be seen as a way to de-Russify the country, which would be oppression of more than the majority of the country. And second, it would invite a Russian invasion. And as the director of the CIA, Burns, pointed out at the time, this is not something that the Russians would want to do, but they wouldn't see having much of a choice because this would be too big of a provocation. Now, getting to the Europeans, they were fully on board with this analysis. When they were going to offer this membership action plan, which is a time limit, or what is it, the timetable for getting the Ukrainians into NATO, the Germans and the French, they opposed it. And as we know, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, she said, well, if we give them a timetable to join NATO, that would be interpreted as a declaration of war against Russia. So they all knew very well that this was a huge provocation, that this would lead to military conflict. But again, Bush at the time, he said, well, we were going to do it. He wanted his legacy to expand further. And the Europeans, in my opinion, it's a lot of weakness because they knew what would happen. But again, the United States said, well, we're going to do it anyways. And, we tag along. So
it like still perplexes me by how the United States did all of these studies about the possibilities of the blowback effect of Russian sanctions, and the European Union did the same thing, and yet they followed through with European sanctions. What are we on the 12th or the 13th package of European sanctions against Russia? To me, that is almost like putting 6 bullets in the chambers of the gun and putting it to your head, especially when you are dependent on Russia for cheap fuel. The United States is just like Europe is dependent on on Russia for cheap oil and gas and other commodities. The United States is highly dependent on Russia for cheap nuclear fuel also, which produces about 25 to 30% of all of U.S. nuclear energy, which is crazy to sanction Russia like that. And as you were talking, I was looking at this article from yesterday, and the title is on RT, and it says, West struggles with sanctions, according to the Kremlin. And it says, international restrictions do not work in the way they were intended. President Vladimir Putin's spokesman said, Russia has managed to turn the tables on the West when it comes to sanctions. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said on Saturday, noting that a myriad of restrictions have failed to crash the Russian economy. Now, knowing that and seeing the devastation that it is wreaking, the havoc that it is wreaking across the European continent, why are they contemplating introducing another round of sanctions, which have proven to be more detrimental to the national security of the European Union and the economic stability of the European Union? Isn't that insanity?
Well, it certainly sounds like the definition of insanity. If you tried it 13 times, it doesn't work. Try 14. So it is strange, but it actually gets a lot worse because I think often, the United States, it often speaks in the language of values, but at the end of the day, it will look after its national interest. I think I often get the impression the Europeans have fully bought in on this ideological slogans because I think we're going full in and sacrificing ourselves on the sanctions. Now, you mentioned Germany. Keep in mind, this was the economic powerhouse of Europe, driving what's left of European competitiveness forward. But again, Germany is a manufacturing economy. They manufacture and export. And when you have a lot of energy-intensive export, you need access to cheap, reliable energy. That's the artery. That's the main blood of any heavy industry. And so, what happens when you start to sanction Russian energy, and then also conveniently the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up? Then of course they're going to have a lot more expensive energy, and one after another, their energy-intensive industries are now going bust. And just as they're at their weakest, of course they need new energy, so they go to the Americans, and they have to buy it much more expensive. And now there's even a dispute because they were supposed to have a set price, but instead the Americans are insisting that those agreements don't apply, and There's no spot deals. Now they have to do spot deals now, so they have to pay much, much more. And there's nothing the Europeans can do because they made themselves all dependent on the United States. And, allies is nice and well, but allies doesn't mean you have the same interest all the time. So, so they're slowly coming to terms with this. And making matters even worse is as all these European industries are collapsing because they can't afford the expensive American energy doesn't make them competitive. They're now discovering that the United States has this what do they call it? Reduction, the Inflation Reduction Act, and so they have all the subsidies now for industries in the US. So they're walking to the Europeans, telling the German industries which are failing, hey, just move across the Atlantic and set up business here. So now the business are leaving Europe and going to the US. So the French economic minister, this is the amazing quote. First, when they began the sanctions, he said, we're going to crush the Russian economy. We're going to bring it to a halt. And now, a few months ago, 2 months ago, I think he said that the Americans, with the expensive energy and this Inflation Reduction Act, that it's become an existential threat to European industries, that they are, they're taking it over. So we were slowly learning that sanctions in the unipolar era, it might have worked when we were the only option. But as we're discovering in the multipolar era, that if you sanction someone too harshly and for too long, they simply learn to live without you. And that's effectively, we got so upset with Russia, we forgot that, they also got quite upset with us. Keep in mind that, if you look at the Russian side, ever since, you can argue, Peter the Great 300 years ago or Gorbachev 40 years ago, they had this goal of a greater Europe or a common European home. The Russians were pursuing this. They wanted to be a part of Europe, but we expanded NATO as a way to not have to create a Europe without the Russians. Anyways, my whole point is they were kept clinging on to the possibility of having a greater Europe until 2014. When we toppled the government in Ukraine. Then it became painfully evident that Ukraine would not be a bridge connecting the West with Russia, but it would be a bulwark, a wall, or build them up as an ally against the Russians. So at this point in time, the Russians realized there would never be a common Europe, and this is when they began to decouple. They began to look for other partners for sourcing technologies, industries. They needed new transportation corridors, new banks, new use of different currencies, payment systems, so across the board. And then they started looking east. That's when they abandoned what they called Greater Europe and began to embrace what they call now Greater Eurasia. So instead of having Europe as its main partner, it now wants China. So this is such a mistake on such a huge historical proportion. We pushed so hard to make sure that the Russians wouldn't be a part of Europe, that instead we gave this huge giant and made it the best, most important partner to China. So it's hard to overstate how incredibly foolish the last 10 years has been in terms of not wanting to find any peace with the Russians. Because one can disagree, of course, with their decisions to invade and all of this, but their security concerns, they were quite reasonable. Imagine the United States if it was the other way around. They were proposing to bring Mexico into military alliance. They would put their missiles, their troops on America's border. They would act in the same way. This is a reasonable security concern, and it could have been met. And instead, we pushed it, and this is I think a mistake on a huge historical proportion.
And it seems like America is deliberately trying to deindustrialize their European partners by the policies that they continue to push and the demands that they continue to put on individual European countries and the collective European Union or whatever. And my thing is, Germany being the second most powerful Western economy, why would you follow America down this path, knowing that it may lead to this? Isn't that suicide? Because Germany is, like you said, was a industrialized country, and manufacturing was his bread and butter. and to lose cheap energy is suicidal for the economy, which means it's suicidal for the European Union because it is the number one economy in the European Union.
No, it is, and it's quite unbelievable because keep in mind that throughout the Cold War, the Europeans were always very much subordinated to the United States because their economies were weaker and they were very security dependent on the United States, which enabled the U.S. Can convert security dependence into political loyalties. But then what happens? The Cold War comes to an end. The security dependence isn't high anymore, and the Europeans start to integrate their economies, and they have this ambition for having some more equality with the United States. We're going to have a unipolar moment in a partnership, the Europeans and the Americans. This was the dream, and especially over the past few years, the main words going around in Brussels was, we want European sovereignty and strategic autonomy. These are all nice words that can be translated into we want more independence from the United States. We want to have our own foreign policy. We want to act like the United States, act like an independent actor. This was the main goal. Now, if you want this, you have to have a strong economy. You need to have some strategic autonomy, but you also have to diversify your partnerships. Because if you put all your eggs in one basket, that one country is going to have a lot of influence over you. We often talk about interdependence, but we have to look at the symmetry. If we have two countries like U.S. and Mexico, Mexico will be much more dependent on the U.S. than U.S. is on Mexico. That asymmetrical interdependence is converted into political influence. And so we wanted more symmetry with the Americans. But what happened now? The Americans and they talk to Germany and say, hey, let's just cut off energy. Let's have full sanctions the European economies they're not going to recover from this. This is a disaster, and meanwhile, because we chose to redivide the continent and militarize these divisions, we're now dependent on the U.S. again for security. So now there's this huge asymmetry in which the Europeans will be so much more dependent on the U.S. because the economies are weaker. The little economy that's left is completely reliant on the U.S. And of course, we have to be under the security umbrella. So it's quite remarkable how foolishly, especially the Germans, have played their hand. But again, I think if you listen to them talk, Baerbock and Scholz, they're very much ideologues. Now again, I think historians will look over what a ridiculous set of policies were pursued here, because this was all very easily avoidable. So,
in my eyes, and from my viewpoint, it seems like they're purposely running the U.S. economy and the European economy into the ground. I mean, from a person just looking at the insane policies, the insane tactics that these leaders continue to push, it's like they're purposely deindustrializing Europe. They're purposely destroying the European economy. It's like God has their mind or something, and they're confused and insane. And they're telling me, I have to look at this and say, well, your hatred for Russia is that strong where you would risk all of these nations to implement a policy that is tantamount to madness, because this is America's policy, because she wants to dominate the world and she sees Russia as a alternative pole of power, and this is unacceptable with American policies. There was a writing by some think tanks were saying years ago, talking about how America should be so strong as not to allow any rival or near peer rival or combination of powers to ever rise up to challenge her. And I believe this blind way of thinking has pushed these policies on the rest of the world, and they've become not beneficial but detrimental to American sovereignty, American power, and European economic prowess. Do you see any madness in the politicians and in the policies that they continue to push? Because it seems like they continue to just run full speed at a wall, thinking that the wall will eventually get out of their way.
Yeah, well, I think this is also been the main mistake for the United States, was when the Cold War came to an end. There were two options. The U.S. could pull back a bit. It can, reduce its military expenditure and instead improve, the social issues within the U.S., get its house in order, but then take a more moderate position. But instead, the U.S. Had a different objective. It said, it would embrace the unipolar moment. In effect, the security would be dependent on the US being all dominant, so having global primacy, having the final say in every corner of the world. And yeah, the document you're referring to, it came out in February of 1992, so it was merely 2 months after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this was known as also the Wolfowitz Doctrine, this defense guidance paper which came out. It was leaked, and it showed that the only way that the U.S. can be safe is if it dominates, and it had to prevent the emergence of any possible rival or group of rivals. And they even mentioned Germany in that in that group. The Germans couldn't become so powerful that they might challenge the primacy of the United States. So it's I think this is the source of a lot of the problems, because unipolarity was never going to work. As many critics pointed out in the 1990s, what's going to happen is the US will spend a lot of its resources transferred from the core to the periphery to, rule the world. And the US will begin to bankrupt itself, spend all this money. It will develop then domestically all the infrastructure, social programs, everything will begin to collapse. So society will weaken itself as wealth is transferred to dominate the world. And at the same time, the rising powers of the world would seek more to cooperate, to collectively balance the United States. So my question would be, is any of this in the United States? So we can forward now 30 years and see how did the social experiment go? Well, it went exactly this way. The US has huge financial problems. This is not going to end well at all. There's no way this can end well. There's no possible outcome which permits it. And domestically, there's a lot of problems in society which could have been solved by redirecting or having different priorities in terms of spending. And look at its rivals, Chinese, Russians, Indians, Brazilians, all these countries coming together with, they wanted a multipolar system. Now they're building one almost in opposition to the US. This is not great for the US either. So it's everyone loses. And I think this is when you see all this resentment around the world, people don't really hate America. People tend to like the American Republic. They don't like the American Empire. That's usually how they see it. And I think it's a great shame, especially if you look at countries like China and Russia. Look at their policies in the 90s. Their main foreign policy was to get as close and friendly with the US as possible. Now, 30 years later, their main policy is to work together in order to decouple from everything from American industries, technologies, their transport corridors, their banks, the US dollar, and also, of course, militarize so they can counter what they see as being America's military posturing. So I don't see how this is in anyone's interest. So it's ideally we would have some reflection over what we have done and maybe change course. But the only impulse seems to be to double down, unfortunately.
And speaking about how you were just talking about how this ends badly for the United States, I was looking at Bloomberg article, and it says U.S. debt interest bill rockets past a cool $1 trillion a year. Now, that's just the interest on the debt. And I ask this question a lot to guests that I have on the show, because I'm trying to rationalize insanity because their policies are insane. How can you, on one hand, beg China, Russia, and the global South to continue to buy your debt, and yet you continue to demonize them, provoke them, stoke tensions, and push for war against them? How is that even sound or rational? Aren't you alienating the very people that you need to buy your debt to maintain your way of life?
Yeah, this is the problem with the US dollar. It becomes twofold. One hand, you want some fiscal discipline, because the dollar is not just the American currency. This is now, has been the reserve currency since the Second World War. So the problem here now is when the U.S. Prints a lot of money, there's two ways of taxing. You can tax people's income, or you can tax the money they already have. So if you print money, you devalue the value of the dollar. So all the people around the world holding trillions of dollars in dollars, every time the U.S. central bank prints more money, all their savings are weakened. So it's, the U.S. has this wonderful position where it can essentially tax the whole world in order to run its own budget deficits and to have the highest standard of living and enjoy this privileged position in the international system as the hegemon. However, there's a second problem, which is that, well, when you exploit this too much, when people don't think that the dollar will be reliable if it's dropping too fast in value, the rest of the world will seek to decouple. So that's number one. And that's why you see countries who are even friendly to the United States are now getting very uncomfortable holding the dollar. You see it from Malaysia to India. They want alternatives because they don't see this is not going to last. But then there's a second problem. If you have already overinflated your dollar, the last thing you want to do is to weaponize it, use it as an instrument in great power politics, because this was supposed to be a common utility, and instead it's used as a weapon. And so if you're the Russians or the Chinese, you're having a double, it's just a twice as bad situation, because now when the U.S. finances its military by printing money, they're effectively taxing the Russians and Chinese. So the Chinese and Russians are actually paying for their own containment, in which the U.S. is building their military against them. And then for what? The U.S. even stole or froze hundreds of billions of dollars from the Russian central bank. This is absurd. I mean, who wants to hold these dollars anymore? It's crazy. The Chinese, they know they're next on the chopping block. So, they have a limited time to get rid of these dollars. So they're really moving into, finding another way around this. And this was avoidable because the Chinese were kind of happy having the US dollar as a reserve currency because of the excess liquidity. It enabled them to be more of an exporting economy, which could then export to the United States and then finance some of the US debt. This was working for the Chinese, at least until 2008. So it's a terrible, terrible policy. And it's you can't walk it back. It's kicking the can down the road. Yes, the US can dominate a little bit longer. However, it's now the rest of the world has become more determined to drop this dollar, and when all of these dollars come back home, it's going to create a huge problem. And again, even the Chinese, which see the U.S. as his main competitor, doesn't want to see a collapse, because the U.S. holds an important position in the international economy. So even they don't want to see the U.S. collapse. They just want the U.S. to take a more moderate position, and it could be in the U.S. interest as well.
Okay, now you know that, and I know that, and I'm pretty sure that the politicians in Europe, I know around the world know that, but I'm specifically talking about Europe. European politicians should know that. So why would they put all of their eggs in the American basket, going along with all of these provocations against China, all of these provocations against Russia, knowing that we're working toward an eventuality of the dethroning of the US dollar? And if you are working with the United States in such a way and America collapsed, that leaves you vulnerable, because people will remember that you made your way with the US empire to try to halt the rise of China or the reemergence of Russia or the emergence of a multipolar world. What sense does that make to attach yourself to a declining currency, a declining empire, and a declining world order?
Well, it doesn't. And again, that's what you want to. That's what a sensible politician would do now. Would be, again, not to turn their back on the United States. I mean, the U.S. should be considered, a friend and an ally. But you want to diversify a bit. Having all your eggs in one basket is rarely a good idea. But when that basket is also a declining hegemon, you really want to diversify. So this has been my point as well. I think Europe should adjust itself to how the world is changing, and the way it's changing is transforming from unipolarity to multipolarity. And if we want to remain relevant, we should have diversified as well. But they're actually doing the opposite. Because first the United States told the Europeans, listen, cut yourself off Russian gas. You don't need Russian energy. Just, they're authoritarian. We're democracy. Become dependent on us. But again, it's much more expensive. And as we find out, the US will also break deals if there's money to be made. So, but then the US comes back saying, hey, listen, the Chinese, they're quite authoritarian as well, aren't they? Let's cut ourselves off Chinese technologies and industries. And the Europeans, of course, follow this path as well, and then we cut ourselves off the Chinese. So at the end, we're going to have very inefficient economies and also being excessively dependent on one partner. And I guess this is the disadvantage of war, because the United States has a huge military, and a key source of influence for the United States is it converts security dependence into political and economic loyalties. And when military tensions rise, that's why NATO usually comes first. NATO says, they identify China as a threat. And once it identifies China as a threat, then, okay, well, how is Europe going to stay safe? Well, depend on the Americans. So now the US has leverage. They can start, well, if the Chinese are a threat, then you shouldn't buy their technology. You should buy ours. And suddenly we start to slowly cut ourselves off, or decouple, or de-risk, or whatever words they're using for it now. But at the end of the day, we're chaining ourselves to a declining hegemon, and it's I don't even think it's going to be good for the US in the long run, because Europeans are quite loyal friends of the US, and you would want your friends to be stronger, and Europe is there's no future. I think it's going downhill very quickly.
So what is it like on the ground in Ukraine? I know America sent the CIA director to Ukraine. What is going on, especially after the spate of strategic failures on the part of the West and Ukraine? What are they trying to put together, or what are they trying to do vis-a-vis Russia, as Russia continues to press on all ends of the line of contact?
Well, so far, I think they're just trying to put a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. I think there's not much that can be done, and I think we're reaching a breaking point, which is, you can see it in the media now, because they're already starting to change the narrative where they point. Because keep in mind, for almost 2 years they said Ukraine is winning, and it was always nonsense. This is a war of attrition, and if you see what's happened over the past year. Russia began to mobilize hundreds of thousands of men, building all these new weapons, drones, missiles, across the board. This huge force in the back, which is ready to strike. And at the same time, NATO was pouring in weapons to the Ukrainians, and so they could go on their offensive. They get everything destroyed. They give them more weapons. Everything gets destroyed. Now they had this major defensive in the summer. And they just ran into this Russian defensive lines. It was like running into a brick wall. Just incredible, horrible losses, men and equipment, and then the Russians began to go on the move, and now they're effectively cracking through a lot of Ukrainian defensive lines, and so all the numbers, you can just look at the numbers. If 80% of casualties are by artillery, well, what does it mean if the Russians have 10 times the artillery and ammunition compared to the Ukrainians? NATO said they don't have anything else. That's why the Americans are giving cluster ammunition. The Russians are dominating the sky. They have better air defense. They have better drones. They have a sea of missiles, which seemingly is never-ending supply. And NATO now saying, well, we don't have any more weapons to give. Also, political sentiments have turned against them. They're saying, we don't have the same support. You see this in the US especially, where I think it's probably mostly the Republicans which are starting to give the Ukraine war a cold shoulder. So there's nothing that can work anymore. Everything is going the wrong direction. And then, of course, you have the war now in Gaza, which means the US needs to prioritize, and obviously Israel will come before Ukraine. So there's it's a hard situation. In any reasonable way in a situation, the Ukrainians would say, listen, this game over, let's sit down and negotiate before the Russians start storming our cities. However, there's a problem. Once Zelensky says he wants to negotiate, what's going to happen then? The military will hold him accountable because he's been fighting PR wars, doing all this crazy offensive. So when the military said they should be on the defensive, so the military and Zelensky, they're not going on very well these days. The civilian population are quite upset because they're finding out they lost a lot more men than they've been told. And then, of course, you have the right-wing groups, the more neo-fascist ones, who will not accept any negotiations with Russia or any compromise or concessions. So once they're put in a position where they have to negotiate, I think the Ukrainians will very quickly turn on each other. So there's no good outcomes anymore. And also in the West, we're not fighting Russia. If it was our soldiers, we would probably negotiate it by now. But we're fighting with Ukrainians, so we don't really have the huge incentive yet to negotiate either. So it's just dragging on. But the numbers don't lie, and you see every day the Russians are growing stronger, and every day the Ukrainians are going weaker. So if we had some humanitarian empathy here, we should have tried to strike a deal. Like I've said, if we at least can offer we're going to stop expanding NATO, which was the source of this war, then perhaps we can strike a deal which will put the Ukrainians in a more favorable position to be able to hold on to more territories. But there's nothing. There's no talks, nothing. And it's quite pathetic because all of this hardline policies is being done in the very moralistic language that we're not going to negotiate about territory or anything, and meanwhile we're making matters much worse.
I was talking to Alex Craner last week, and he was telling me he had a thought on this matter, and it was similar to Gregory Manarino's thought on this matter about the expansion of NATO, and it was about how the Western system has to continue to expand and has to continue to take on debt and and as they take on debt, they have to take on new resources, meaning they have to go and find an enemy so that they can extract brain power, capital, commodities from them to keep the empire going. I believe that's a logical conclusion that you can come to, especially when you see that America's and NATO's expansion policy doesn't make sense. They continue to expand even past its needed point. Like it just continues to provoke and continues to stoke and continues to antagonize everybody. And I believe that it is because they need resources. And if the NATO dragon continues to take resources, it can feed the fire in it. Once it stops, there is no resources, the fire goes out. And I think that is similar to the United States empire. It continues to push and prod because it needs debt to exist. And without debt, I believe everything goes up in flames. What say you about the matter?
Well, I think that's also a consideration for the Russians because the way they see it, they wanted to get a stop to NATO expansion, but we were very clear there wouldn't be any negotiation on this. NATO will expand, and Russia should have nothing to say. Well, that's why. When Russia went in with its military, it was to put pressure on the West, because that's why they began negotiations 3 days into this invasion with the Ukrainians, saying, okay, now you have to make a deal. But when we still didn't want to make a deal, when we convinced the Ukrainians to fight instead, that's when the Russians decided, okay, we'll just take territory. And if you see the territory they want to take is from Kharkov all the way to Odessa, because these are the historical Russian lands. These are, Russian speaking, this was transferred to become a Ukrainian republic within the Soviet Union, but these were, Russian cities and with Russian speakers. So this is kind of the where they will be most welcome, if you will. So this is why they want to take this territory, not by all, of course, but more so than going to the West, where everyone hates the Russians, Western Ukraine, that is. So, but also my point is what is common with this territory as well. It's not just where all the coastline is, because that would mean taking all of Ukraine's coastline, Black Sea coastline, but it's also where a lot of or almost all of the heavy industries. This is where you find most of the gas and oil reserves. this is where you find all the black earth, the really fertile soil. So essentially all of Ukraine's economy is within these oblasts, which are the traditional historical Russian lands. So it's so some of the idea is also make Ukraine less attractive to NATO. So after Russia takes what it wants, then make sure the rest becomes a basket case, because then the US would lose interest. If there's no ports they can use, if there's no natural resources, if there's no industrial power they can get their hands on, the idea would be, well, if it's just a poor landlocked region, then the United States would lose interest and it would not be high on its priorities anymore. So I'm sure that that is part of the issue. But I think part of the problem was, after the Cold War, was simply, I think a lot of the motivation for expanding NATO has been geopolitical as well, because we initially had this agreement with the Russians in 1990 and then in 94 again, that we're going to have an inclusive Europe. But then we decided, wait, why if we expand NATO instead and cancel this inclusive security institution with Russia, the OSCE, then we can have hegemony, and which would also benefit, of course, the empire in terms of economic interests. But what happened then was, how are you going to create a Europe without the largest country in Europe, Russia? This is difficult, and then you're going to have to expand, of course, NATO all the way to its borders, and create some tensions between Russia and its neighbors. And this is effectively what we've done. I mean, people keep, I turn on the news, I see this narrative, oh, the Ukrainians just always wanted to get out of Russia's shadow, get away from his boot, but this is not true. You see, every poll from 91 to 2014, when we toppled the government, showed about 20% of the population wanting to be part of NATO. The rest, majority, did not. They wanted closer relations with Russia. Even NATO has a document from 2011 when it recognized this, saying, oh, this is a huge problem. How are we going to how are we going to get the Ukraine into NATO when the government says it doesn't want? Only 20% of the population want to join NATO. And again, that's one of the reasons why we toppled the government. This is there wasn't many other options. So this, you mentioned Burns before, but there's also worth pointing out that William Perry, he was the Secretary of Defense under the Clinton administration in the 90s. He has a great interview when he points out, well, the obvious, which was everyone in the administration realized that if you expand NATO, relations with Russia would collapse. This one country wanted nothing more than to have a close relationship with the West and US as possible. That relationship would fall apart if we expanded NATO. Like he argued, he was making this argument within the Clinton administration, and he points out no one disagreed. This was very obvious. Of course, this would be a stab in the back. However, he said, in the 90s, Russia was weak. It was getting weaker. Who cares what they think? That was the main takeaway, according to him. So they're weak. Yes, the relations will collapse, but who cares? They're weak Russians. They're going to get weaker. There's third-rate power. No one cares about Russia anymore. But, wouldn't you know, eventually Russia began to recover, and now we're paying the price.
And I know time's of the essence, so I'll just want one or two more questions with you. Where does this thing go in Russia, in Ukraine and Europe? We see Russia decoupling from the West and hitching its wagon to the global South and China. We see the United States taking on huge amounts of debt, spending itself into oblivion. We see the European Union following suit, following America. Where does this end? Does it end in all-out war? Because remember, when we talk about the Ukraine scenario, America is not just pressing Russia and Ukraine. They're pressing them in Kazakhstan, Armenia, and all of these other areas, trying to hit nerves in Russia, to put pressure on Russia, because they believe that Russia will overextend itself. Where does this end? Does it end in your opinion? Does it end in an economic collapse for America first, or does it end in a face-to-face conflict between these two rivals?
It's hard to say. I don't have a crystal ball on this one. It's too many different variables. Too many things can go. It depends on too many irrational actors, I guess, what decisions they will make. I think what's going to happen with Ukraine, though, is you're going to see now over the next couple of weeks, I think the Ukrainian defense will begin to collapse more and more. The military command and Zelensky will have more tensions as they begin this collapse. And at that point, the United States and its European allies will need to make a decision. Do we now jump into the war and fight the Russians directly, as especially the British seem very eager to do, or do we just let it collapse? So this is very either or. I think many in the US, they think that, once they're done, fighting Russians with Ukrainians, they will just say, okay, let's just freeze the borders here and we'll make peace. That's not going to happen, because they know very well, because hear what the Americans say: just freeze the borders, we'll rearm Ukraine, we can do this in a few years. That's the last thing the Russians want. They already fell for the Minsk agreement, so they're not going to fight this war in 5 years. They want a permanent settlement on this, and there's no trust, so that leaves very few possible options. So I think that once the United States recognizes it can't freeze the front lines, and it's either collapse or join the war, I think that's when you'll have that prospect of a nuclear war will come up. So in terms of the economy, it's hard to say. The US, it's a huge economy. It has still cards to play, but it's better shape than the Europeans, at least it seems. But that being said, it's hard to predict this kind of things. But something is obviously going wrong here. There's all the debt maturing now. Like how you mentioned $1 trillion now only in interest. What are they going to do now? As it's $1 trillion extra, the debt keeps growing more and more, putting so much pressure on the currency. So you have to protect the currency, put up interest rates. It's more expensive to service the loans. You want to reduce the interest rates to make the interest payments more reasonable. Well, then the economy will start to fall apart. So there's no good way out of this. I think they spend most of the tools in their toolkit. So something's going to go wrong, I think. But I don't know. I'm too cautious to say when. So
yeah, I think sooner or later that there will be eventual head-to-head conflict, because I have never seen America willingly walk away from something, even when it's in her best interest. And when we look at the situation, Russia has drawn its red lines in the areas that it perceives that are vital to its national interest, and they have said that they don't want war, but if you cross these red lines, it would force us to do X, Y, and Z. And America continues to cross these red lines. Britain continues to cross these red lines. And NATO continues to cross these red lines. And I believe that is because they see the economic situation deteriorating for the West. And I believe they are starting to realize militarily that they're losing it, because remember, Russia has defeated, 2, 3, or 4 NATO-built armies in Ukraine. And with the full backing of the NATO alliance, the US, Britain, and all of NATO is being defeated and out-manufactured in military equipment by Russia. America has this ego. These leaders have this ego that if I can't rule, I will not allow anybody to rule. And we see that with her policies and her deployment of troops everywhere, and her moves to make everything chaotic and unstable around the globe. I believe that will eventually lead to a standoff or even a conflict. You don't see that?
No, definitely. And this is quite open policies as well. You mentioned before seeking divisions between Russia and its neighbors, and the US has been very open about this. I mean, it's not just Ukraine. They did the same with Moldova, Georgia, all of the Central Asian states. They're trying to split the Turks from Russia. They're trying to split the Indians, the Chinese. But this is, almost become cliche, but that's how you do, divide and conquer. This was also, you referred earlier on to a document in terms of the US keeping a hegemon 2 months after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this was a key idea, is you have to prevent the cooperation between these different centers of power. So keep the world divided, then everyone is dependent on the US, and no one diversifies by connecting with each other. So this is it is an imperial policy, and but it's just it seems like an irrational one, because Russia's not a it's not a threat to Russia, to the United States. Its economy it can't replace the US. Its economy is somewhat moderate. It's not but the main adversary economically to the United States would be China. But the US now locked itself into fighting Russia in Ukraine, and now also fighting in the Middle East, which can spread and will spread, I think, very quickly to other parts as well. It doesn't have to, but it looks like that's the direction. So its whole goal of pivoting to the east and confronting the Chinese, which also would be unnecessary. I think the Chinese aren't. We always assume that if the Americans aren't ruling the world, then China will rule the world. But the US will be the last country to have global primacy, because there's too much spread of power. So there's a multipolar system coming along. So it won't be possible for the Chinese to dominate the way the Americans did in the 90s, for example. So, but anyways, my point is simply, I think the Americans locked themselves into all these conflicts, which removed some of their focus. So. And this is the problem of being a hegemon. If you have all these resources, you lose focus. You don't have to prioritize anymore if you think you can do everything, and also you can make a lot of mistakes because you can absorb the costs and the pain. But after a while, all these costs will start to accrue, and your relative strength will weaken, and then you will see. Your inability to prioritize will lead to horrible decision making. So I think that's where we are at the moment, and it's very unfortunate, and it's bad for America. It's bad for the world. So ideally, usually have these huge summits or to how to restructure the world. For example, from a unipolar system to a multipolar, but usually these come after huge wars. It would have been nice if we had some proper diplomats who could start to have these talks before a war would occur. But no, I tend to be quite pessimistic.
So you're saying death by 1,000 cuts for the U.S. empire and the Western world. Thank you so much, Glenn, for joining us on the Red Pill Diaries. I got to get you back here again whenever I can, man. You're awesome. Thank you for giving us your time. We really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right, be blessed, bro. Everybody, we just brought to you Glenn Diesen. I watch him all the time. I listen to his take on things a lot, and so I wanted to bring him here for you guys. Please hit the like button, subscribe, hit the like button, share the video, let everybody know that we're being suppressed by the algorithm, and let's keep it pushing. We're going to try to have, I don't know if we will now, but we're going to try to have a second program later on this evening if I'm able to get back in home at a reasonable time. I have a lot I have to do today, but I just wanted to take the time out right now. I thank each and every one of you for joining us on the most powerful platform for truth, bar none, across the web. This is your platform for empowerment, enlightenment, and education. This is the Red Pill Diaries, and I'm your host, your friend, and your brother, Rashid. On that note, we go out the same way that we came in. Hey, you know what I'm saying? I'm Mrs. Barber Legs' baby boy. This is Rashid signing out. Hey, mama, guess what, everybody? I got to say it live on air. Your baby boy loves you more than life. Deuces, everybody. Thank you all for joining me. We're out of here.